but to me, it's a description of what we find in nature. And so it's not about what we want to be true. It's about what is true in the psyche. And so I certainly feel that most of us find identity and fulfillment in one or two of those archetypes. Doesn't mean that you can't have a third that you're also pretty fluent with, but most people are not all four. And I think there's, often in the culture, there's certain systems that want people to say, oh, you have to be all four of these. And I just think that creates an unrealistic pressure.
I'm Casey Main, a jaded, hopelessly romantic, health-conscious party girl searching for meaning. And my mission is simple: to make life better, for myself and for you. I believe real change always comes from within, and the Better You podcast was born to discover hidden parts of ourselves and our stories. A safe place where we have real, honest conversations with people from all walks of life to help better understand ourselves so we can become better versions of ourselves. So come along on this journey of discovery with me so you can become a better you. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Better You podcast, where we focus on better understanding our relationship with ourself. I'm your host, Casey Main. Thank you for being here. This is another episode I'm super excited about. I know that I tend to be very excited about all the episodes, but this is just kind of the perfect follow-up to last week's episode with Paul Jung about, especially regarding the discussion on gene keys. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, definitely do, because it's very similar to today's conversation in terms of we're looking at these different archetypes that we have within us. And today's conversation is really more of a mind episode because we're looking at it purely from a psychological viewpoint. Whereas last week with Paul, it was a little bit more of a spirit episode because we were kind of looking at it from a little bit more of a spiritual, or some might call it woo-woo perspective. But if you've been listening to the show, then you know that I absolutely love and I'm all about all things woo-woo. So definitely listen to that episode if you haven't checked it out yet. And speaking of our relationship with ourself, I am struggling with mine a little bit in terms of accepting the fact that I just had a birthday and turned 36. So if I sound a little bit tired, it's because I am recording this the day after my birthday. And I don't know, there's something weird about 36. It's funny. When I turned 30, I had no issue with it. But then when I turned 31, I was like, oh, this is weird. And the same thing has happened. I had no problem with turning 35. And then now 36 just feels kind of surreal. I guess it's because I'm kind of over that mid-30 hump and making my way towards 40. I don't know, but I do not feel that old. I like to think I don't look that old, but it's a weird one. So I am struggling a little bit to integrate my new age into my relationship with myself. But I will get over it, as it is just another step towards fully accepting and embracing who I am, aging and everything. All right, so because I am a little bit tired today, we are just going to go ahead and jump into talking about this week's episode. So a little bit more about today's guest. Gary Bobroff is the author of Knowledge in a Nutshell, Carl Jung, and Crop Circles, Jung, and the Reemergence of the Archetypal Feminine. He is the founder of Jungian-oriented and Jung Archademy, and the developer and facilitator of Archetypal Nature. He has an MA in Jungian-oriented psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute and a BA from the University of British Columbia in Canada. So like I said, this is a psychology-focused episode, and for those of you who don't know, I was actually a psychology undergrad major in college and have always been fascinated by psychology. So today we're talking a lot about kind of the schools of thought from Carl Jung, who is extremely fascinating, and as you'll hear in the episode, has really shaped a lot of our culture today. All right, so in this episode, we discuss a brief history of Carl Jung, his work, his contribution to psychology, and his influence on our culture, the human psyche and the different views or definitions of it, our egos and how they can be underdeveloped or overdeveloped, how we need a strong sense of self in order to grow, archetypal principles and where they exist in our culture and our psyches, 4 common personality archetypes and their different characteristics, whether we should try to enhance each archetype within us or settle for being in one or two, how to identify our archetype and how to look at other archetypes to further our own growth, how we can get trapped trying to live in a different archetype because that's what we think we are supposed to be, how understanding the different archetypes can help in relationships, especially family, and how archetypes impact dating and romantic relationships. So super interesting stuff. I will link to Gary's website and then some of his articles that do a little bit of a deeper dive into the archetypes for those who want to read more about it to maybe try and help figure out which one you are. But I don't know. I just find this so helpful in terms of how we view ourselves, but also how we view others and kind of just recognizing different archetypes within people and being like, oh, okay, that's kind of their operating system. That's their value system. It might be different than us, but so be it. We're all different and we need all of them. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and jump into this conversation with Gary. I'd like to start with kind of your background and your experience and what it is exactly that you currently do.
Okay. So what I currently do is mostly I administer Jungian Online, which is a website that connects clients that want to work with Jungian analysts and therapists from all over the world. And I teach and write. So I do workshops and webinars and write books.
Okay. And so for those who aren't familiar, when you say Jungian, what does that mean?
Okay. Jungian comes from Carl Jung, who was the heir apparent of Sigmund Freud, who started looking at the unconscious in psychology. And so Jung, although he had studied on his own and was a medical doctor, psychiatrist on his own, came to be Freud's heir apparent. And for a few years, they worked very, very closely developing Freud's school of psychology. But eventually Jung broke with Freud and started his own school and very quickly became a very prominent psychologist on his own in his own right. So by, they were together 1910, 1913, 14 in there. And then by 1920, Jung published Psychological Types, which gave us the extrovert, introvert, thinking, feeling that most people have some familiarity with today. And then he would go on to talk more about, later the term synchronicity is a word he gave us. The way we talk about archetypes and dreams is all from Jung. He really informed a great deal of our psychological language, and it all revolves around the unconscious. So, Jung and Freud are basically about the fact that, the conscious mind, the ego self that we experience in our waking state is not the whole ballgame of psychology, that in fact, the ego sort of is like the tip of the iceberg, and the larger bulk of what's going on in our psyche, in our inner life, and in how we experience ourselves in the world really grows out of what they call the unconscious. So this psychological matrix beneath our awareness, which is where dreams come from, and much of our reactions to the world are formulated before we even can respond consciously. So the reality of the unconscious is really what unites Jung and Freud. And then Jung split off and started his own branch of psychology. And like I said, gave us the terms synchronicity and introvert and extrovert and archetype and dreams. So Jung's a huge influence kind of behind the scenes of our culture. And he was very popular even by the 1920s. The Psychological Types book was reviewed in newspapers all over the world. And, writers like D.H. Lawrence and James Joyce were reading Jung and talking about Jung, and James Joyce even sent his daughter to be treated by Jung. So Jung, for almost 100 years has been a huge influence on our culture, and it's behind a lot of things that people may or may not, know about.
Okay, so how much of I'm going to guess then like a big bulk of just psychology as we know and understand and teach and learn about it today is influenced by him as well as Freud. But then what is kind of then the difference between like what makes Jungian psychology like its own thing? Like what does the broader term of psychology kind of have within it that he didn't necessarily subscribe to?
Yeah, so I mean, you can look at that two ways, like his break with Freud and then his break with the general psychological world. So Jung is still very much, if you go to most American universities, you can get a whole degree in psychology without ever reading Jung. So Jung is still his own world. The break with Freud came, to simplify it, had to do with Freud's belief that all spirituality and creativity comes from repressed sexual urges. And Jung didn't subscribe to that. He really felt that there was a spiritual impetus in us that was just as powerful as the sexual instincts. So those kind of things, those kind of concerns led Jung down on his own path. So like I said, I mean, he's well known in the culture, but he's certainly outside of the psychological academy in America in particular. You can go to other places, in South America, Jung is taught in undergrad and is hugely popular. And Europe, it's a different mix as well. I mean, what makes Jung different, I think, from the mainstream is the interest in the unconscious. There's, the bulk of psychology, as you would learn it in a university, is mainly biological and sort of brain science and, neuropsychology and different schools that focus on consciousness and our waking awareness. There's not a lot of wrestling with the unconscious in the larger psychological world. And you can see that partly in the emphasis toward pills. You've got a problem here, take a pill, make it go away. Jung didn't believe that. And the whole school of the Jungians that come after him, including people like James Hillman and, Clarissa Pinkola Estes and Marion Woodman and many, many figures that come from Jung or are Jungian analysts or were. People that are interested in the word soul and wrestling with what's going on at a deeper level in the psyche, and that don't see the psyche just as a function of biology, that there's something bigger going on there. And it certainly, for me, fits with experiences that, the major view of the psyche, when they reduce it to biology, they can't deal with things like synchronicity. They can't deal with any evidence that the psyche is bigger than the brain or the mind, which of course there's a lot of. We could talk about that, but Jung focused on working with dreams, working with images, working with archetypes, which he believed were a part of a collective unconscious that the whole human race shares, that everyone born on this planet, every human born on this planet has an inheritance of archetypal forms inside them that are shared, so that you can have, he would have a child who would have a dream of a certain religious image, and then he would find that image in some, ancient Chinese alchemical text or something, and he would see that there's something going on, that there's a shared basis somehow to the psyche that's bigger than just our personal experience. Those kind of things, again, wrestling with mysteries like synchronicity. Why does it happen that, we have these strange incidences that are full of meaning that cannot be made sense of from a reductive point of view? Jung sees meaning built into the world. So, we can have events happen that are serendipitous, are strange and weird and seem full of meaning and really do point to something inside of us that's happening. So Jung sees a world that's full of purpose and that is bigger than just biology. So it's that whole other piece that's left out by a lot of psychology today.
That's so interesting because I love that, and I love that he incorporates the soul and that we're all connected in kind of a bigger thing that's happening. And there's many different ways you could describe that based on your own beliefs. But I guess I didn't know that, I never thought about that mainstream psychology doesn't incorporate that, and that even the word psyche, like I always thought that the human psyche that did involve kind of that underlying unconscious programming. But so I guess like let's get into some just like basic definitions here. So like what is the human psyche as described in kind of, I guess, broad terms?
Yeah. So, well, for Jung, it refers to not only our waking awareness, consciousness, but this larger field of the unconscious that we experience in dreams. And in those moments where we say things like, I don't know what came over me, I don't know what made me do that. That there's this level to us that is below conscious awareness, yet that's operating all the time. And Jung also felt that there was this deeper level, too, of a collective unconscious, so that there's figures inside us that are bigger than just personal, that there's a part of our psyche that is not just from our particular historic experience, but that is something, that transcends all of us, that these figures live in all of us in a different way than just personally and historically. So for Jung, the psyche includes all of those things, includes this idea that there's an unconscious matrix out of which consciousness emerges. And that explains so much of behavior, right? Because, where did Jung and Freud start? They started working with clients often in their time that were hysterical or that were expressing some behavior that people didn't know why. Why are they acting this way? And of course, they turned to hypothesize the unconscious, and we experience that ourselves in dreams, in reactions to the world that we maybe would rather not have, or that are surprising to us. And Jung felt that there was a way that our personal growth and maturation was an expression of the integration of more of the unconscious, of becoming more true to ourselves and more fully expressing the whole pattern of who we are. So it's a very different model, say, than the predominant, say, maybe medical model of the psyche, where it's, if there's something going on in personality, some symptom, it's a function of chemistry, or it's a function of something being broken, somewhere mechanically. When Jung is looking at a very different point of view, and it's rooted really in an ancient point of view. The traditions that believe in soul, the traditions, whether it's alchemical or from the medieval ages, those points of view that are, philosophical and spiritual, and seeing the disturbances of the soul as something more than just, biological issues.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the way that I've always, or not always, but I think I saw this somewhere and it just really stuck in terms of trying to understand the conscious and the unconscious and the collective unconscious. And so let me know if I'm on or if I'm off here. But it's kind of like picturing an iceberg. And I think this analogy is used a lot. So the part of the iceberg that is above the water is our conscious, like what we're aware of. The part of the iceberg that is below the water is our unconscious or subconscious. And this is where I don't know the difference between the two. So we'll get into that in a second. But, and then the collective unconscious is like the water. Like if you think about one iceberg in water, but there's lots of icebergs and we're all connected through the water.
Sure,
how does that work for you?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. So then what is the difference between the subconscious and the unconscious?
Well, Jungians don't really use the term subconscious, but I think the way most people use it, it would just refer to something that's unconscious, probably personally unconscious. But like I said, Jungians don't really use that term. But
okay, is that a mainstream psychology term? Like, where did that come from in my brain?
Yeah, it's mainstream, or maybe pop psychology. I don't know exactly where subconscious comes from, but it's pretty commonly used. I mean, for us, we would just say it's just the unconscious.
Gotcha. Okay. So you mentioned the term ego, which I want to hear your explanation of what the ego is, because I think I've heard it defined kind of in more psychological terms. But then I also have like a very spiritual side. So in kind of the spiritual community, it's almost defined differently. So like, what is your definition of ego?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the Jungian world, we would talk about ego or our conscious mind as something that we need to have a healthy version of. So we have to have a healthy ego, a healthy sense of self, the ability to be aware of ourselves and make, somewhat good decisions to take care of ourselves. So, if you have a healthy ego, you have some ability to ask for what you need and to take steps to take care of yourself. If you're lacking if you don't have enough ego development, which is very possible, and a lot of people in the Eastern and the spiritual communities in general, I would say, miss this, is that one can not have enough ego. One cannot have a healthy sense of self, thus that they're not able to take steps to take care of themselves, to ask for what they need, to go out and fight for what they need, to survive or what they want. So we certainly view ego as not something that is to be gotten rid of, but that you have to have enough of it. Now, you can say, well, some people have too much. Okay. but it's certainly something that people need to develop and have a healthy ego, and that it's very possible to not have one and to be going through life, maybe as a bit of a doormat, or maybe, in victim, or those kind of things. So, it's a healthy sense of self, a healthy awareness of our wants and needs, and being able to do what we need to do to meet those.
Okay, I like that, because I think sometimes in the spiritual world, ego a lot of times is like villainized, like it is this negative thing that's out to make us miserable at the end of the day, and that we need to silence or completely get rid of. But first of all, I think anything with too extreme like that is maybe not where we need to be. But I like your explanation of it. It's part of being human. Like, it is part of the experience here in this life. So it's better to like work with it than try and get rid of it, because we're still living as humans here in the society that we're in.
Yeah, and in general, there's we talk about Jungian analysis. We haven't talked really about the people that do the Jungian work, but a Jungian analyst is someone who goes to a Jung Institute and trains for a long time and works on their own stuff and undergoes a long-term therapeutic process. They have to have done 100 hours with an analyst themselves before they begin their Jungian analytic training. They do another 300 usually during that time. So 300 session hours with them as a client, in addition to all their training and everything they learn, not only about the Jungian point of view, but usually attachment theory and other things. So Jungian analysts, to me, are really masters of the plumbing of the psyche. They really, really know what's going on there. But even then, with all that training, so many clients that come to do that work with the Jungian analyst, we talk about there's sort of two halves to the work. The first half is very often like ego building, getting the client strong enough in their sense of self that they can move on to do the later work. And the later work, we talk about in Jungian psychology, looking at your shadow. Well, you can't really look at your shadow, parts of yourself that you maybe don't want to see, if you don't already have a healthy ego. You need to have a strong sense of self to really face the contents of the unconscious that we haven't integrated. And that's the work of life, the work of Jungian analysis. But there's a necessity that the ego be strong enough to begin with, because if you don't have a strong sense of self and you're facing some things, contents inside you that might be challenging, then you can shatter. You can have psychosis. So, the first half of Jungian analysis is still building up the ego, reminding a person what's good about them, reminding them their good qualities, reinforcing their sense of self, mirroring them, reflecting back to them their reality, and building that up. So the ego is important. It's not something in the Jungian world that we're trying to get rid of at all.
Okay. All right. I like that. Okay. So I want to talk about the different archetypes. Okay. So let's start with what does that even mean? Like, what is an archetype in terms of our psyche, and even then like the collective unconscious?
Sure. Yeah. So The term archetype means first principle or first impression. It comes from the ancient Greek philosophers. And so it's the idea that there are these forms out of which nature is made. So there's certain types of energy or values that are stamped into nature. So we might think of, very often we think of the gods, the mythological deities and figures as archetypal. So you have, the god of war who embodies all of those warrior principles of action and doing, and it's often associated with masculinity. Different archetypal principles. Plato talked about, the good, the true, and the beautiful. So there's different archetypal forms that are seen as lying behind what happens in nature and what happens in the world. In the Jungian world, we identify certain specific archetypes that we talk about with the understanding that these are figures in the psyche that in every culture you're going to experience the trickster. In every culture, there's an image of the king or the queen or the emperor. So there's certain archetypal figures that people know right away, and you see in the mythology all around the world. That was Jung's, insight about the collective unconscious came from seeing the same modes of story over and over in all these different cultures. So the archetypes are like, from the Greek, these first figures, these forms that give nature its kind of dominance. It's, often they're oppositions, opposite types. Like you can think of maybe the sun and the moon. The sun's, bright solar light, and the moon's softer nighttime light. And we could talk more about those two as archetypes. Often they're oppositions. But in the Jungian world, we tend to talk about archetypes in ways that some of your listeners might be familiar with. Things like the shadow. So in the Jungian world, the shadow is an archetype that represents the qualities that are maybe the values that are rejected by the conscious self. So it's that you have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the daytime persona that thinks of itself as good and upstanding, and the nighttime persona that expresses all of the instinctuality that's been rejected. And so those kind of polarities are part of what we see in the archetypal world. Jungians also talk about an inner feminine and masculine figure inside us, the anima or animus. We talk about the archetype of the self being the religious instinct in us that's also responsible for keeping us ourselves through a process of growth. And so, we talk about God images in connection to the self, or we can have a dream of a God image that has this power, special power for us. And then in my personal work, I go into looking at a series of archetypes that Tony Wolff talked about, who was Jung's close companion, that is more specifically to do with personality type and that kind of thing. So,
okay, those are the like father, mother, seeker, companion. I read one of your articles on those. Okay, yeah, let's dive into those, because I thought those were fascinating in terms of there's like two different ones for like personal and impersonal, right? Is that how it was described?
Yeah, and these come from Tony Wolff, who I said was Jung's close companion, and she felt that in 1921, when the Psychological Types book came out, which she helped Jung write, that there was something missing from that. And she identified what she called 4 structural forms of the feminine psyche. So 4 archetypes by which women find identity and fulfillment. And they were the mother, and opposing that one was what she called the hetera, or the companion, and those are both connected to people in different ways. And then the impersonal archetypes she talked about were the Amazon, which is a warrior energy, and what she called the mediatrix. And the mediatrix comes from the medial woman, the woman who knows through the unconscious, who has information without the causal path of getting it. She knows, they talk about, intuitive knowing, or, women's wisdom, that kind of thing. Of course, it happened for men too. But that's what Tony observed. And then there's a whole school by which those have been developed. And I'm part of that lineage. Different teachers added the forms for men and women. So we've got the whole system for both men and women now. What's really interesting for me is over the last few years, I've been looking at how that system lines up with the 5 Tibetan Buddha families. And I see a really strong parallel between what Tony saw as alive in the collective unconscious and what the Tibetans describe in the 5 Buddha family system. So what she talked about with the mother was the figure who is finding satisfaction within the group, within the collective, within the family. And in the work of Tada Noreen Guzzi, which came after, they talk about the forms for men. So we have father and mother, as they called it. And for me, those folks tend to find identity in the collective, in the group, in the family. Their energy goes first into that unit, whether it's a company or children or the country or their army group, or different forms of collective, as opposed to the other archetype, which, as you said, seeker companion, are the masculine feminine forms. And again, we don't use, when we talk about seeker and companion, that's a word we can use for both genders. We have both the terms, but I use them interchangeably for men and women. And those folks tend to be more individual identified. They're more interested in doing with others. Mother, father tends to be more about doing for, more kind of socially rebellious, more welcoming of the new. You could talk about behind the companion and the seeker, as we call it, from Tada Noreen Guzzi. Behind those archetypes would be the archetype of, say, the lover and the child. So those folks tend to be very comfortable in spaces of intimacy, sexuality, sensuality, and the archetypal child is bringing the new. And Jung talked a lot about how important the archetypal child is to our growth going forward. So the seeker companion types tend to be people who are constantly growing, constantly becoming, and that, of course, has its own risks and ups and downs and shadows. But they tend to be an opposite type to the mother-father type. The other direction, the impersonal folks, they tend to find their identity and sense of self not through people. So in Amazon or warrior, the masculine feminine terms for one archetype, those folks tend to find their satisfaction in the world through doing, through accomplishing, through being the fastest, the strongest, the healthiest, the richest, the most successful, the most accomplished, the best. That can be a musician too, or a business person. And then opposite the warrior Amazon, we have the sage and the mediatrix. So the sage is the man or woman who identifies himself through their ability to solve problems, solve puzzles, to attain understanding, to reflect and know how things work. And you can do that. We sort of talk about the sage as the conscious mind, the knowing through conscious awareness, and the mediatrix, knowing through the unconscious. And some people, of course, are both sage and mediatrix. Certainly Jung was. He had lots of, strange knowings from a distance and from ahead of time that were inexplicable. So you can have one person be both sort of sage and mediatrix in that end. But these 4 different divisions, most people tend to be 1 or 2, but there's many people that live their life really through 1, if you can be honest. And I've done that work with a lot of people, and some people, identify with each one of these, and sometimes just singularly. But each is a different pathway to growth and development. And each can become a way we flower and bloom into who we are. And there are, some people that look at archetype systems and think, well, I have to be all of these things. And in my experience, most people tend to really, have their sense of self rooted in 1 or 2, whether they like it or not. And there's certainly a sort of consumerist drive, I think, particularly in America, that wants to be everything and hates being told, yep. you can't, you're not everything. But I think it's part of nature, right? For me, Jungian psychology is describing what we see in the nature of the psyche. It's not, our point of view. You can say it's theoretical, and it's certainly, in a certain way of using that word, it is. But to me, it's a description of what we find in nature. And so it's not about what we want to be true. It's about what is true in the psyche. And so I certainly feel that most of us are find identity and fulfillment in 1 or 2 of those archetypes. Doesn't mean, that you can't have a third that you're also pretty fluent with, but most people are not all 4. And I think there's, often in the culture, there's certain systems that want people to say, oh, you have to be all 4 of these. And I just think that creates an unrealistic pressure. So And like I said, we've found this connection to the 5 Buddha families, which really reinforces that this is a structure in the collective unconscious. That here we have Tibet and Switzerland, both discovering and describing a personality type system completely independently, and it matches up pretty well. So I'm currently writing a book about the connections between those two. So you'll hear more about that from me in the future.
So that's interesting, because when I first read it, I thought between those 4 divisions, we were 2. Like, you're either father, mother, or seeker companion. And then in addition to that, you're either warrior, Amazon, or sage, mediatrix. So you're saying it's more between the 4. Most likely you're rooted in one of them.
Yeah, one or two. So,
okay.
I think if we look at, certainly for me, I'm rooted in seeker companion and sage mediatrix. And I think, Jung would be rooted there too. Tony Wolff would be rooted there. And I want to say that, in my work, I see, we always want to privilege our own point of view. People always want to say that my way of being is the best way. And one of the things that I really see, because I see mature, well-developed people living in all these different combinations, like, the father warrior combination would be the classic boardroom combination, the classic business person combination, or mother Amazon. And, if you look at a political figure like Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, or Sarah Palin, Mama Grizzly, right? It's the aggressive for the tribe energy. And, I think you can have a fully realized life in just those 2 archetypes. And really, we can think of a great football coach, Vince Lombardi in the States, right? He was father warrior. His energy went into the team. If you look at the things that he said, quotes from Vince, it's always about, serving the team and how can we serve the team, and, all the individuals pulling for what's best for the team, and that there's a magic that they can do in the collective. And so to me, rather than saying, oh, well, to be a mature human being, you have to be the same point of view as me, I don't think that's true. And I've seen a lot of people bloom and blossom and become fully realized human beings, as far as I'm concerned, in each of these combination spaces or in an individual archetype. So, we tend to want to think, oh, everybody has to be everything and all this. And, maybe that's a bit privileged or something to have that point of view, because I just see people predominantly in 1 or 2. And, there's some people feel, strongly I'm 3 or whatever. And, we should let each person have their own journey with the material. But I think it's important to say that each of these has a way of expressing something sacred, each of them has a different view of spirituality, and understanding these differences and being curious about them, and accepting that people are different from us, and there's different ways to be a good person and to fully express yourself. And I think that's one of the nice things about this model, is that it lets us see differences without too much judgment.
So are we always the same archetype, or do we change over time, or is it something that's just kind of just rooted in who we are?
Well, my point of view is that most of us start in a particular spot. So that spot could be 1, or it could be sort of on the outside of the circle of the 2 axes, anywhere on the outside of that circle. So you can be a mixture of 2 from the beginning. But I think there's 2 or more different ways of looking at that. So, say that you start in, let's say you start in mother, and then you have an early life raising kids, and then you get to 35 or 40, and you want to go back to school and become a professor. So you might say that this person was always a mother sage type, and she was expressing mother in the first half of her life, and in the second half, she's going to move and express more of the sage. So that would be kind of a classic development in the archetypal work that I teach. And that can go from any one archetype to another, but you would say, well, they were both there. In the first half, they expressed this one. The second half, they're expressing that one. So that kind of development can go on, or you might say another way of looking at it is, for me as a seeker sage, I can look sort of across the circle, one might imagine, to father warrior and say, well, what can I learn from those archetypes in order to grow and become a better human being. I might need to work harder. I might need to work on my network and connecting. I might need to work on my physical body to get in better shape, to feel healthier with more strength, the warrior. And those can all be pathways to development. But I think the danger then you get into the territory of saying, well, I need to be all of these archetypes. And in my experience, people are not all of these archetypes. There's some people that want to think they are, but I think we are not. And so I would say if our tree is rooted in a particular combination of archetypes, that we keep that in mind, that we want to bloom from that point of view, look to our opposite qualities to grow and even out and balance out. But if we start to judge ourselves from an opposite archetypal point of view, then we're going to feel pretty bad about who we are. And so it's very dangerous to start saying we need to be all of these things. In reality, most people are really good at one or two areas of life, and they understand themselves and they get their sense of self. It's very different to get your sense of self, say, from the lover than from, say, the collective, the group. So those are very different energies. And so, so many of us have built-in tendency to judge ourselves harshly. So sometimes, these archetypal models, if they're used the wrong way, I think can feed that. And so for me, I really try to help people see the gold of the archetypal combination that they live every day. And then from there, understand people that are different and see the shadows. And we can talk about all the growth that's possible, but keeping a sense of it being okay to be who you are.
And so how do we figure out which one we are? So I feel like I'm the seeker companion, but maybe that's just what I want to be. How do you know what you are?
Yeah, I think it's a process, and everyone's process is going to be different. So I think it's about contemplation. I think working with, a therapist or analyst to talk about it. People can certainly take my course right now. It's Archetypal Nature is the name of the site to check out the course. The Foundations course is an introduction to the material. Probably going to be rebranding that in the future into another name, but for now, that's where it is. When this new book comes out, you'll know more about it. So I think it's a process. And, I think there are certain archetypes that are more sort of normative, or what you're supposed to be, right? Like in the personal growth world, you're sort of supposed to be the seeker companion. Generally, that's the normative thing you're supposed to be. And a lot of men and women find it hard to identify with mother, father, because those words are so loaded.
Right.
And so that's, for me, part of the appeal of using the Tibetan language is to emphasize, to get that label of mother, father off, because that's hard for people to identify with. Some people. I mean, I've had other people, no problem, come right up to me and say, oh yeah, thanks for the workshop. I'm mother, father. So it's a personal battle, or some people just feel like, oh, right away they click and identify. And I think, one of the things I see is with women who have medial experiences, who have knowings that come, through the unconscious intuitively, or in ways that are not, causal. They know things without knowing why they know them. The mediatrix tends to be one of the most empowered from this work, because it's an eternal story. I think every culture in the world before the West, for the last couple hundred years, burned them at the stake. Almost every culture in the world has made a place for the woman who knows through the unconscious. Think of the oracle at Delphi, or other figures like that. It's been celebrated, and ours rejects it because we're on such a rational, masculine kind of trip. We don't want to deal with that deep feminine knowing, which men can have too. So, I think everyone's journey is going to be really different. But for example, with the mediatrix, just seeing it there, I think is very empowering for those women and men. So it's going to be very different. And I think some people, may not really clearly identify, or it may take them years, or a lot of people do start at one place and migrate as they work with the material more and more. So it's really everybody's own journey. And sometimes the struggle means it's more valuable. The journey's more valuable. So.
Yeah, I definitely so you describe the mediatrix as, problem solver, solution finder, way shower. They ponder, they're curious, they want to figure it out. Their unconscious flows into understanding what makes it tick. So, there's a part of that I feel very drawn to as well. But I'm curious because is it possible to fall into a trap of like trying to live your life as a certain archetype because that's what you think you're supposed to be? Like, I feel like maybe I lived a portion of my life more in the like mother archetype because it's like I was trying, but it like wasn't really fitting.
And what did that look like for you?
I think it ultimately ended up looking more like people pleasing than actually doing for others in a more coming from like a strong sense of self place, like I'm doing for others. I know who I am and I'm doing for others because it gives me joy, whatever, versus I'm doing for others because, I want them to like me.
Yeah, I think, one of the more powerful experiences that I've had with this work, and I can remember a specific time this happened in Los Angeles almost 10 years ago. I had a gentleman come up at the end of a workshop and say, "Oh my God, I've spent my whole life living as a father warrior type, but I'm really a seeker sage type, the opposite. And oh my God, my father lived his whole life as father warrior, but he was really seeker sage." So, there can be the way we're raised and we're brought up is all about these tensions. Think about, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but the 80s TV show Family Ties, where they have Alex Keaton, right? This conservative figure in this house that doesn't share his values. And so that, he brings the father warrior energy to people that are living from a different place. And so much of our family tension and upbringing can be about parental expectations. How many parents, think about the frustrated athlete parent that wants the kid desperately to fulfill those ambitions for them. I was doing this work in Europe one time, and I had a woman who, after seeing the warrior archetype on the first day, she was up all night, pretty much just, she said, vibrating, thinking about the warrior. It was really struck her really hard. And she said, "I don't know, should I stay here the second day at the workshop? I'm so, agitated by all this." I said, "Just, stay and see what happens." And when we started talking about children and families, she expressed that her mother had been a concert pianist, and her whole upbringing tried to push her to become the same level of musician. And she never wanted it. It was never hers. And so she was able to identify that her mother had these unfulfilled, Amazonian archetypal energies that she was trying to foist onto her daughter, who was not that archetype. And it was such a relief to let go of that story. So, I think those kind of tensions are a big part of growing up for a lot of people. And I think this can be really powerful for them to understand that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's powerful to understand and look at in terms of yourself. I'm big on understanding ourselves, hence this podcast. But I think it's also super helpful in terms of looking at other people in your life, your personal life, professional life, you encounter on the street, whatever it may be, and just kind of that deeper understanding that we're different. Like we can be different. Like people are driven by different things. They see value in different things, and it doesn't make any one way right or wrong, but it just kind of helps ease some of those tensions of constantly trying to make the people in your life be how you are, or not understand, the way that they are. So like, for example, like I would say my dad is probably very much warrior and probably father warrior, I would say. And whereas I don't know that I'm either of those. So, but to know that, okay, his kind of view of life, and that's where his expectations come from, that very like action oriented, like do. And just because like I don't necessarily fulfill those doesn't mean I'm, like a disappointment. I'm different.
Exactly. And I think people often are carrying through life like an unfinished argument about why are those people that way?
Yes.
Why, why aren't you like me? And it's constantly this unconscious thing that they're carrying forward. And, when I, hear you talk about your dad and the warrior, I mean, I think a lot of people will understand, if you, certainly as a guy, if you're in a locker room, there's a kind of a locker room talk that isn't just sort of about women. It's that warrior constantly sort of verbally chiding each other, cutting each other down. The whole locker room energy can be this, all it is making jokes about each other, making fun of each other, ripping on each other. And that's a part of warrior culture. It just is. Mm-hmm. And so those folks are very different. If you're not that archetype, you're not going to enjoy that. You're not going to get into it. And so people do have very, very, very different values. In fact, opposite values. And that's very hard for people to understand. And I think in general, people want to always say, oh, why aren't people like me? And so for me, it's very powerful to understand this and accept that people are different and see people differently. I think there's a big political connection here. And I use the archetypal work in political consulting. And it's very clear that there is a correlation with that as well. So to understand these archetypes is to understand some of what's rooted behind our politics and our divisions as well. So I find it really powerful to just be able to view folks through this lens and accept that people have different values, and that from my point of view, nature intends that.
Because if it creates balance.
Yeah, exactly. And we need different kinds of folks. I mean, even, look at ants. Ants have army ants and worker ants and a queen bee. There's a queen bee, and then bees, there's a nurse bee. And you see this stuff all through nature. For me, the system I teach is part of nature, not just human nature.
Yes. Do you think that it plays a role in romantic compatibility? Yes. Or is it just a matter of understanding the differences? Or do certain archetypes do better with other archetypes?
Oh, if only it were so easy. This
will be a new dating app, dating by archetype.
Well, there's two different things, and they absolutely conflict, and it really explains a lot of dating for me. So, in the Jungian psychological view, we have inside us an inner opposite figure. So I have inside me an inner opposite feminine figure. And one of the things that we see in looking at that figure in dreams and in a variety of ways is that figure tends to be opposite personality type. So if you're an extrovert, your inner figure tends to be introverted. Well, it's also true archetypally. So we tend to fall in love in that romantic fall in love way with people who reflect our inner opposite. So when they say opposites attract, that's what they mean. We tend to be attracted to the opposite sex, opposite archetype in that unconscious, maybe you call it love at first sight or romantic love, like that automatic kind of strong pull is towards the opposite. And in later life, in the Jungian world, we see that same figure leading us into ourselves, into doing that integration inside us, not through projecting it out in the world onto another figure. But at the beginning of life, we'll find the attraction that way. Now, the problem is that you're getting attracted to people who are opposite. So
that's going to bring up a lot of tension.
You're almost certainly not compatible.
Or that would really, if you're aware and open to it, be a great incubation for growth.
Absolutely, exactly correct. Yeah, it can be, especially as we get older and we've started to integrate that stuff inside us a little bit, it can become fuel to growth. But at the early stage, it's usually not. If you're 20 and this is happening, right, it's probably a full opposite. So I had a fall in love experience when I was 17, 18, 19 with a woman. And years later we met, and she was the exact opposite personality type for me, and certainly was opposite archetype as well. So that's very common. But the other end of it is that in general, people do want to mate, especially when it's a conscious choice, want to mate with somebody who shares their values. So you'll find a lot of, father warrior type. Maybe he's like, running a hockey league, or, he's a firefighter or whatever, want, a queen Amazon wife, someone who's going to be there to raise a family and want to go for a run and share those kind of values. So we might be attracted unconsciously to the opposite. Consciously, we generally want a partner who shares our values. So you see the...
Yeah, right there. Yeah. That's a little bit of an issue.
Yeah. As we get older, it can work out, and you can, like you say, you get older and you start, well, maybe I want someone who's a little bit opposite, but maybe we have one archetype in common, those kind of things, So as you get older,
I might be saying that just out of hopes, because my current partner, he's definitely a father warrior. Okay. And so if I'm identifying more with kind of the seeker companion sage mediatrix, and I mean, we are opposite. And I see that, and I'm aware of it, and it does, granted, I'm in a very growth phase of life, but it does allow a lot of opportunities for that inner growth for myself, to just recognize, okay, we don't see things the same, and that's okay. And kind of that whole like accept and love somebody as they are, even though they're different.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. And there's usually a lot of fuel for attraction with the opposite too. So.
Okay, cool. Like that going for me. Okay. So I want to end on just hearing a little bit more about your new book.
Okay.
So I believe it's titled Knowledge in a Nutshell: Carl Jung, the Complete Guide to the Great Psychoanalyst, including the Unconscious, Archetypes, and the Self. That sounds like a lot of information. Is this book like 3,000 pages?
No, it is not. It's part of a series that's out from Arcturus Books in London. And so it's, I hate to say it this way, but kind of a Jung for Dummies.
No, that was going to be my next question. Like, would I understand it, or is this only for, real like PhD psychologists?
It's meant to be as readable as possible. It's meant to be a book that anyone who's interested in Jung could enjoy and get a lot out of. It's 40,000 words, so it's small, 10 chapters, very short book, meant to be very readable. And what my friends that have read it have said is that, it gives you a look into Jung that's quick and readable without losing the depths. So that's a great compliment to me, and I hope that's how people will enjoy it. And we do get into, all the kind of basics and some of what we've covered here today. We don't get too much into the archetypes, as we've discussed, but stick more to what Jung was talking about. And you can order it on Amazon or wherever you get your books from, and really pleased with it.
When does it release?
It's out on Kindle.
Is it out?
It's out on Kindle now. It ships from Amazon US in 10 days, May 15th. It starts.
Okay, so then it will be out by the time this airs. Okay. So it is now available.
Okay, great.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for this. Welcome. This is just really like fascinating stuff. Tell everybody where they can find. So there's Jungian online, like just all your different sites, all your work, all of that.
Sure. Well, my personal site is gsbobroff, gsbobroff.com for all my writing and different projects I do. My main work right now is Jungian Online, that connects people with clients that want to work with analysts and therapists, people that do Jungian psychotherapy via live video. So wherever you are in the world, if you want to work with an analyst via your computer, your phone, with live video, you can do that at jungianonline.com. And there's no fee for the referral. We set that up for you for free. And there's a form there you fill out to get started. I'm also starting a new project called the Jung Archademy, 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 Jung Archademy, which is a teaching platform. Lots of the analysts and the authors that are on Jungian Online wanted to have a teaching site. So that's our new site, Jung Archademy, Archademy.com. And for the archetype work, archetypalnature.com, archetypalnature.com. And I'll probably rebrand that when the book that I'm writing now is completed. So thank you, Casey, for giving me a chance to talk about all this stuff.
No, absolutely. I absolutely loved it. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
All right, that'll do it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, then please share it with a friend or two and consider giving the podcast a rating or review if you haven't done that already. That means a lot to me and really helps with discoverability of the show. Make sure you are following us on social media at The Better You Podcast on both Instagram and Facebook. And if you have feedback for me, you can always reach me at thebetteryoupodcast@gmail.com. And I am not sure which episode I'm going to air next week yet. So make sure you are subscribed and following on the socials so you find out what it's going to be. I've got just so many great conversations already recorded, and I'm just still trying to figure out the order in which I want to air them. So it's a little bit of a mystery until next week. But again, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful rest of your day.